I spent 500 hours building my father a legacy. I hand-carved it from ancient cedar and cold, unyielding maple, pouring every ounce of my respect, my history, and my desperate need to be seen into 32 small, wooden figures. I wrapped it in velvet and craft paper, tied it with twine, and handed it over on his 60th birthday with a heart that still, against all logic, felt like it belonged to a hopeful child. He threw it in the trash the next morning. It was still in the wrapping, the twine uncut, sitting on top of the grease-stained pizza boxes and discarded party napkins at the curb. My name is Michael, I'm 32 years old, and before I tell you how I walked away from my family and reclaimed a stolen inheritance they never thought I'd find, let me know in the comments, have you ever been the invisible one in your family? The person whose successes are treated like hobbies and whose presence is an afterthought? I stood at that curb at 7:30 a.m., the air tasting like damp asphalt and wood smoke, staring at the corner of my soul sticking out of a plastic bin. The garbage truck was 3 blocks away, a low, grinding mechanical beast working its way toward my father's house. In 5 minutes, my 3 months of labor, the nights I'd spent with eyes stinging from sawdust, the weekends I'd sacrificed to find the perfect grain, would have been compacted into a formless cube of waste. My father, Harrison, didn't even unwrap it. He didn't even look at the brass plate I'd engraved with the words, "To Dad, 60 years of building things that last." He had simply hefted the box, found it heavy and unfamiliar, and decided it didn't belong in his world. The scariest part wasn't the rejection. It was the silence. I didn't scream. I didn't storm back into the house where my father was likely sitting at the kitchen table, wearing the store-bought luxury watch my brother Julian had given him, drinking coffee as if the world were exactly as it should be. I just reached into the bin, pulled my box out of the trash, and walked back to my truck. I placed the masterpiece on the passenger seat, buckled the seatbelt around it as if it were something fragile and alive, and drove away. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. I didn't call my mother to cry. I just left. And as the miles stretched between me and the house I grew up in, a cold, hard realization settled in my chest like a stone in a well: you cannot pour love into a container that has no bottom. I had spent 32 years auditioning for a role I was never going to get, and the play was finally over. I was officially a ghost in my own bloodline, but what they didn't know was that ghosts are the only ones who can see through walls. And I was about to find the secrets they'd buried beneath the floorboards of our family history. To understand why a man would throw away a masterpiece carved by his own son, you have to understand the architecture of the Sterling family. My father, Harrison, is a titan in high-end construction. He builds the kind of homes that grace the covers of architectural digests, glass and steel monoliths that look down on the rest of the world from the hillsides. In Harrison's world, power is the only currency that matters. He doesn't believe in art, he believes in structural integrity and profit margins. My older brother, Julian, was built in Harrison's image. He's loud, athletic, and has a voice that seems to take up all the oxygen in a room. He went into the family business the day he could hold a hammer, and within 5 years, he was my father's shadow. They spoke a secret language of load-bearing walls, zoning permits, and corporate takeovers. They were a two-man army, and I was the civilian caught in the crossfire. My mother, Jolene, was the architect of the family's peace, but her method was to sweep the rot under the rug until the floor was uneven. She was sweet, well-meaning, and entirely complicit. If my father ignored me, she would compensate with a casserole. If Julian mocked my whittling, she would tell me he was just being a big brother. She lived in a world where as long as nobody was screaming, everything was fine. But I was screaming, just in a frequency they refused to hear. I was the quiet one. I was the one who liked books and the way a piece of raw timber felt when you planed it down to the soul. I didn't want to build glass skyscrapers, I wanted to find the figures hiding inside the wood. My father viewed my passion as a developmental delay. To him, carving was something you did at summer camp when you were 10, not something a grown man dedicated his life to. I remember winning a blue ribbon at the state fair when I was 16 for a hand-carved eagle that had taken me an entire summer to perfect. I brought it home, my heart racing, thinking this would be the bridge. Harrison looked at it for 3 seconds, said, "That's nice, Mike," and then spent the next hour talking to Julian about the varsity football scouting reports. That was the template of my life. I was the commercial break between the segments of the show Harrison actually wanted to watch. I moved out at 18, not because I hated them, but because I was tired of being the only person in the room who didn't speak the language. I worked at a hardware store by day and carved by night, living in a small apartment that smelled of cedar and loneliness, still sending gifts every Christmas, still hoping that the next one would be the one that made him turn around and finally see me. The only person who ever truly looked at me was my grandfather, Elias. He was my mother's father, a gentle man with hands that were permanently stained with walnut oil and a spirit that smelled like pipe tobacco. He lived in a secluded cabin 3 hours north, a place of deep shadows and ancient trees. He was the one who put a chisel in my hand when I was 12. He didn't talk about profit margins, he talked about the grain's intent. He taught me that a piece of wood isn't just a material. It's a record of every storm the tree ever survived. "Michael," he would say, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves, "people will try to tell you that building fast is the same as building well. They're wrong. The things that last are the things that are built with patience." Grandpa Elias's workshop was my cathedral. It was the only place in the world where I wasn't the disappointment. He didn't have a television or a fancy watch. He had a workbench that was over 80 years old and a collection of tools that he treated like sacred relics. He saw the way I looked at the wood, the way I could sit for hours just sanding a curve until it was perfect. He knew I was different from Julian and Harrison, and he cherished it. He was the one who told me that my talent wasn't a hobby, it was a legacy. But Harrison hated that cabin. He called it a dilapidated shack and viewed Elias as a sentimental old man who had wasted his potential on trinkets. When Grandpa Elias passed away 4 years ago, I felt like the sun had gone out. The funeral was a sterling production, expensive flowers, a polished casket, and my father checking his watch during the eulogy. After the service, the will was read. The estate was split between my mother and her sister, Aunt Della. The cabin, the tools, the 5 acres of timberland. Everything was lumped into a general fund to be liquidated. I asked my mother if I could have Grandpa's old lathe, the one he'd taught me on. She said she'd see what she could do, but a month later, it was sold at an estate auction to a stranger. I didn't fight it then. I was still playing the role of the quiet son, the one who doesn't make waves. I accepted the loss as just another part of the disappointment I was destined to carry. But as I sat in my truck with the rejected chess set, watching the sunrise over the suburbs, I realized that I was done being the victim of their simplification. I decided to drive north. I needed to see the cabin one last time before the developers tore it down. I didn't know then that the cabin wasn't just a building, it was a vault. And inside, hidden behind a loose floorboard in the workshop, was a truth that would turn my entire family's world into sawdust. The decision to build the sovereign chess set was born out of a moment of profound, desperate weakness. It was my final Hail Mary, a 3-month-long prayer carved into wood. I had spent my entire adult life trying to find the right frequency to communicate with a man who only listened to the roar of heavy machinery. I thought, if I could just bridge the gap, if I could take his world of structural integrity and merge it with my world of artistry, he would finally have to admit I was a sterling. I designed the set with a complexity that bordered on the obsessive. The kings were modeled after the towering columns of the Greco-Roman architecture Harrison admired, the rooks were fortress-like, with battlements so precise you could see the individual stones. But the pawns were the heart of it. They were modeled after the tools of the trade, hammers, chisels, levels, and saws. I wanted to show him that I respected the labor that built our family, even if I chose to apply that labor to a different scale. I worked in a fever dream. My apartment became a labyrinth of shavings and fine, white dust. I stopped seeing friends, I barely ate. Every night after my shift at the hardware store, I would sit under the harsh glow of my workbench lamp, my hands cramping as I carved the intricate filigree on the queen's crown. I was no longer just a man making a gift. I was an architect building a monument to a father who had never once set foot in my home. I used ancient cedar for the dark pieces, rich, fragrant, and deep, and cold, unyielding maple for the light. I wanted the contrast to be as sharp as the divide between us. I spent an entire week just on the finish, applying layer after layer of tung oil until the wood glowed with an inner light that seemed to pulse when the sun hit it. It was, without a doubt, the finest thing I had ever created. It was the physical manifestation of 32 years of "I'm here." The rehook for anyone listening to this is simple: we all have that one thing we do to try and fix a broken person. We think if we just work harder, shine brighter, or give more, the other person will finally wake up and see our value. But you have to understand, I wasn't just building a chess set. I was building a mirror. I wanted Harrison to look at those pieces and see the son he had spent a lifetime dismissing. I wanted him to see the patience, the skill, and the structural brilliance that I had inherited from him, even if I had channeled it into trinkets. I packed the set into a velvet-lined box I'd built from the scraps of Grandpa Elias's old workbench, a secret connection to the only man who ever loved me for what I was. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I tied the twine. This was it. This was the masterpiece that would end the silence. I didn't know then that the silence was about to become a deafening roar, and that the something my father saw in that box would be the very thing he decided was worth less than the morning trash. The night of the 60th birthday party was a masterclass in sterling excess. Harrison's house, a glass and steel fortress perched on a cliffside, was filled with the smell of expensive bourbon and the sound of people who used their wealth like a bludgeon. There were 30 people there, mostly business associates and job site foremen, all of them eager to kiss the ring of the man who controlled the skyline. Julian was in his element, holding court near the bar, laughing loudly and slapping backs. He looked like the second coming of Harrison, wearing a suit that cost more than my truck and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I stood in the corner, clutching my brown paper-wrapped box, feeling like a stowaway on a luxury liner. I was the other Sterling, the one people acknowledged with a polite, confused nod before moving on to talk about the new downtown development. When it came time for the gifts, the room went quiet. This was the ritual, the public display of loyalty. Julian went first, of course. He stepped forward with the confidence of a man who knew he could do no wrong. He handed Harrison a small, square box. Inside was a Seiko. A luxury watch with a platinum band and a face that shimmered like a polished diamond. Harrison's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. He held his wrist up, letting the light catch the metal, beaming at Julian like he'd just handed him a holy relic. "Now that's a watch," Harrison boomed, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "My boy knows what a man needs. Quality. Weight. Something that lasts." The room erupted in applause, and I felt the familiar, cold lump form in my throat. It was a store-bought gesture, a transaction of status, and yet it was exactly what Harrison craved. Then, it was my turn. I walked forward, the weight of the chess set suddenly feeling like lead in my arms. I handed him the box. Harrison took it, hefted it with a grunt of surprise at the weight, and unwrapped it slowly. He popped the lid. The room went silent as the light hit the polished cedar and maple. For a second, just a heartbeat, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or a momentary shock at the sheer level of craftsmanship. He picked up the king, turned it over in his large, calloused hands, and looked at the base. Then he set it back down. "Ha," he said, his voice flat and unreadable. "That's something, Mike. Real detailed. Must have taken a lot of sandpaper." He closed the lid, set the box on the edge of the table next to the discarded cake plates, and turned back to Julian. "Who wants another drink?" "Julian, tell them about that problem we had with the foundation on the Miller job." That was it. 500 hours of my life, reduced to a comment about sandpaper. I stood there, invisible again, while the party moved on without me. I watched him show the watch to 3 more people that night. He never touched my box again. The morning after the party was the day the world shifted. I had left my jacket on the back of a kitchen chair, and I pulled into the driveway at 7:30 a.m. to retrieve it, figuring I'd slip in and out before Harrison was even awake. But the trash cans were already at the curb. That's when I saw it, the corner of brown craft paper, the familiar twine. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was just the wrapping, that he'd kept the box and just tossed the paper. But when I pulled the bag open, the velvet-lined box was right there, nestled between a half-eaten steak and a pile of used napkins. He hadn't even taken the pieces out. He'd thrown the entire 3 months of my soul into the bin like it was a piece of junk mail. I didn't go inside. I didn't confront him. I just took my box, put it in the truck, and drove. I drove until the suburbs turned into rolling hills, and the hills turned into the dense, dark forests of the north. I was done trying to be a Sterling. I was going back to the only place that ever felt like home, Grandpa Elias's cabin. I still had the key he'd given me years ago, a heavy brass skeleton key that felt like a secret in my pocket. My mother and Aunt Della were planning to sell the place to a developer next month, but for now, it was empty. It was a ghost house, just like me. I pulled up the overgrown driveway, the tires crunching on dead leaves, and stared at the silver-gray wood of the cabin. It looked tired, reclaimed by the moss and the vines, but it was still standing. I spent the afternoon just sitting on the porch, the chess set sitting beside me. I wasn't angry anymore, I was hollow. But as the sun began to set, casting long, orange fingers through the trees, I felt a strange pull toward the workshop in the back. It was a small, detached building where Elias had spent 50 years finding the shapes in the wood. I let myself in, the smell of cedar and ancient dust hitting me like a physical memory. Everything was exactly as he'd left it before the liquidation, the empty spots where the big tools used to be, the jars of rusted nails, the workbench scarred by 1,000 cuts. I started cleaning, more out of habit than anything else. I swept the shavings from the corners, wiped the grime from the windows. And that's when I noticed the floorboard near the back corner, right under where his old lathe used to stand. It wasn't flush. It was slightly raised, as if something underneath was pushing against the grain. I grabbed a crowbar from the wall, my breath catching in my throat. I pried it up, the wood groaning in protest, and there, tucked into a shallow cavity in the earth, was a heavy, rusted metal lockbox. My name was etched into the lid with a soldering iron, the handwriting unmistakable. It wasn't just a box, it was a message. And as I reached in to touch the cold metal, I realized that Grandpa Elias hadn't just left me his tools, he had left me a truth that my mother and Harrison had spent 4 years trying to bury. The rusted iron of the lockbox was cold, biting into my palms as I hauled it onto Grandpa Elias's scarred workbench. This was the altar where I'd learned that wood has a soul, and now, it felt like the wood was screaming. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my ribs. I knew my family. I knew Harrison's obsession with simplifying things and my mother's talent for erasing any truth that caused a ripple in the Sterling image. I forced the latch. It didn't snap, it groaned, a long, drawn-out protest of metal on metal that echoed through the silent workshop. Inside, wrapped in an old flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of cedar and pipe tobacco, was a thick stack of papers and a single, hand-carved wooden key. I didn't look at the key first. I looked at the document on top. It was a handwritten draft of a will, dated only weeks before Elias passed. My eyes blurred as I read the jagged, elegant script. To my grandson, Michael, who alone understands that a house is just lumber but a home is the spirit within. I leave the cabin, the 5 acres of the North Wood, and the deed to the property in its entirety. This is separate from the Sterling estate. This is his sanctuary, as it was mine. My breath hitched. Underneath the draft was a formal letter from a law firm I didn't recognize, confirming receipt of these instructions for the final update. But I knew the final will. I'd sat in that air-conditioned office with Harrison and Julian while a lawyer read the version that lumped this land into the general estate, the version that allowed my mother to sell it to a developer for a clean exit. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't simplification. This was a theft of the only thing I ever truly wanted. They hadn't just thrown away my chess set. They had tried to throw away my future, my history, and the only place on earth where I felt I existed. I sat there in the dim light of the workshop, the sovereign chess set sitting on the bench beside the box, and for the first time in my life, the invisible sun started to feel very, very real. I wasn't just a ghost anymore. I was a claimant. And I was about to make sure that Harrison Sterling learned that some things are built so well, they can never be torn down. The re-hook for anyone who has ever felt cheated by their own blood is this: the truth doesn't just set you free, it gives you a weapon. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of cold, calculated fury. I didn't call home. I didn't demand an explanation. I knew if I went to them with a handwritten draft, Harrison would laugh and Julian would call it a desperate forgery. I needed proof of the how. I needed to know exactly which hand had reached into the machinery of the law to erase me. I took the documents to a small, independent estate investigator in the city, a woman who specialized in the missing pieces of wealthy families. While she began digging into the digital trail of the law firm that had handled Elias's final affairs, I did something I had never done before. I stopped playing small. I went back to my apartment, but not to sleep. I set up my camera. I took the sovereign chess set, the one I'd pulled from the trash, and I set it up under the lights. I didn't just take photos, I told its story. I posted a video titled, "The Set My Father Threw Away." I spoke to the camera with a voice I didn't know I had, deep, steady, and devoid of the need for approval. I showed the detail of the cedar kings and the tool-shaped pawns. I explained the 500 hours of labor and the morning I found it at the curb. I didn't mention the Sterling name, I didn't have to. The craftsmanship spoke for itself. Within 6 hours, the video had 10,000 views. By the next morning, it was at 100,000. By the end of the week, a celebrity chef with a passion for traditional games shared it with his 5 million followers. My inbox began to groan under the weight of inquiries from collectors, galleries, and people who simply wanted to support the Artisan son. The momentum was terrifying and exhilarating. I was no longer Michael the hardware store clerk, I was a brand. I was receiving offers of $5, $10, $15,000 for a single set. A high-end gallery in the city reached out about a solo exhibition. I was finally being seen by the world, but it wasn't the world's eyes I was waiting for. I was waiting for the moment the Sterling Fortress realized that the disappointment had just become the headline. I continued to work from the cabin, using the tools Elias had hidden for me. Every cut of the chisel felt like a reclamation. But as my business began to soar, the investigator called me with a voice that sounded like a funeral. "Michael," she said, "I found the digital footprint of the final will update. The instructions to simplify the estate and remove your specific bequest didn't come from your grandfather. They came from a phone call made from Harrison Sterling's private office, authorized by a signature that matches your mother's. They didn't just erase you, Michael. They coordinated it." The air in the cabin was still, but I could hear the storm coming. I knew what the plan was now. The developer Harrison was selling the land to wasn't just any developer, it was a subsidiary of Sterling Construction. They wanted the land for a luxury resort project that Julian was slated to manage. They needed my 5 acres to complete the parcel, and they'd decided that stealing it from a son who didn't care about property was easier than asking for it. I sat on the porch of the cabin, looking out at the woods that were legally mine in the eyes of a dead man but simplified away by the living. I wasn't just a woodworker anymore. I was a problem. And the thing about problems in the Sterling family is that Harrison usually tries to solve them with a checkbook or a threat. I waited. I knew the notification of my legal inquiry into the estate would hit their mailbox soon. I spent my days carving, my hands moving with a precision that felt like clockwork. I was working on a new piece, a figure of a man holding a mirror, carved from a single block of lightning-struck oak. I wanted it to be the centerpiece of the gallery show. It was my answer to the trash can. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, the sound of a heavy engine disturbed the peace of the woods. It wasn't the developer's truck. It was Harrison's black SUV, the tires churning up the gravel of the driveway Grandpa Elias had built with his own hands. He stepped out of the car, looking entirely out of place in his $1,000 suit against the backdrop of the mossy trees. He didn't look at the cabin with nostalgia, he looked at it like an obstacle. He walked up the porch steps, his boots echoing with the same heavy, rhythmic thud that used to make me hide in my room as a child. He didn't knock. He just stood there, looking at me sitting in the rocker. "You've been making a lot of noise, Michael," he said, his voice low and dangerous, like the hum of a power line. "The video. The lawyers. Your mother is in tears. Julian is dealing with investors who are asking why his brother is calling the family business a trash heap on the internet." He stepped closer, towering over me. "It's time to stop the games. I'm here to offer you a way out before you do damage you can't undo." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather checkbook, the same one he'd used to buy Julian's watch. "Name a number, Michael. Name a number to walk away from this cabin and delete that video. Because the alternative is a legal battle that will leave you with nothing but a pile of sawdust." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see a giant. I saw a man who was terrified of a ghost. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the wooden key Elias had left me, and I realized there was one more secret in this workshop that Harrison hadn't accounted for, a secret that sat directly beneath his feet. I sat there, looking at the leather checkbook in Harrison's hand. It was the ultimate sterling weapon, the belief that everything, even a son's dignity and a grandfather's legacy, had a price tag that could be settled with a signature. Harrison stood on the porch of the cabin he despised, his shadow stretching across the silvered wood like a dark stain. He didn't understand that I wasn't just sitting on a piece of real estate, I was sitting on a mountain of truth. The legal battle he was threatening was already over, he just hadn't seen the final score yet. I stood up, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't look at the floor. I looked him dead in the eye, and I felt the weight of the wooden key in my pocket. The key that Grandpa Elias had told me would open the eyes of those who refused to see. "Keep the check, Dad," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "You're going to need it for the legal fees. I'm not selling the cabin. And I'm certainly not deleting the video. The world deserves to know what happens to the things a sterling decides are inconvenient." Harrison's face turned a deep, mottled red, the veins in his neck bulging, a classic sign that the Titan was losing control. He stepped forward, invading my space, the smell of his expensive cologne clashing with the scent of sawdust and pine. "You think you're a hero because you got some clicks on a screen? You're a hardware clerk with a hobby, Michael. I built this city. I built the firm that Julian is going to run. You are nothing but a splinter in the palm of this family, and I am going to pull you out." He turned to leave, but stopped at the top of the stairs, looking back with a sneer. "By Monday, the eviction notice will be served. Enjoy the woods while you can." He marched back to his SUV, the gravel spitting from under his tires like gunfire. I watched him go, but I wasn't afraid. I walked back into the workshop, toward the scarred workbench, and I looked at the floorboard I'd pried up. There was a second cavity, deeper and more narrow, that I hadn't noticed until the afternoon light hit it at a specific angle. And inside that cavity sat a small, fireproof cylinder. The rehook for the person who has been told they are nothing is this: those who underestimate you are actually handing you the element of surprise. While Harrison was preparing to crush me with a corporate legal team, I was unscrewing the cap of that cylinder. Inside wasn't another will. It was something much more dangerous to the Sterling brand. It was a ledger. Grandpa Elias's private record from 30 years ago, when he served as the silent partner and primary financier for the very first Sterling construction project. It contained the original soil samples and structural surveys for the Sterling Heights development, the flagship skyscraper that had made Harrison a legend. And the notes in the margin, written in Elias's jagged hand, were a death sentence for the firm's reputation. Harrison insists on using lower-grade steel for the foundation piles. He says the safety margin is inflated by the engineers. I have protested, but he has buried the report. This building stands on a lie. I sat in the silence of the workshop, the weight of the paper feeling like lead. My father hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he had built his entire empire on a foundation of literal and figurative rot. I had the missing pieces of the family history, and they were enough to bring the Sterling skyline crashing down. The days leading up to the gallery show were a blur of sawdust, legal strategy, and a tension that felt like a coiled spring. I wasn't just Michael the artisan anymore, I was a man holding a detonator. I had taken the ledger to a retired structural engineer I'd met through a client, a man who had no love for Harrison Sterling. After 3 hours of reviewing the data, he looked up at me with a face that had gone gray. If this is accurate, Michael, the flagship building isn't just a risk, it's a liability. It won't fall tomorrow, but in a significant tremor. It's a house of cards. I knew then that I had the leverage to stop the resort project, to reclaim the cabin, and to expose the coordinated theft of the will. But I also knew that Harrison wouldn't go down without trying to burn me alive first. He started by freezing my bank accounts, a move he could pull off because he'd co-signed my very first savings account 10 years ago and I'd never removed him. It was a petty, Sterling move, designed to starve me out. I didn't break. The Artisan Sun community I'd built online stepped in. Orders for the Sovereign chess set replicas poured in, paid via a private platform Harrison couldn't touch. My mother called me, her voice a frantic whisper. Michael, please, just do what he says. He's talking about bringing in private investigators to look into your past. He's going to ruin you. I told her that he could look as deep as he wanted, but all he'd find was the son she'd helped him erase. I told her I knew about the phone call to the lawyer. I heard her breath hitch, a long, ragged sound of guilt that confirmed everything the investigator had found. We were just trying to protect the family, Michael, she sobbed. Julian needed the capital for the resort. We thought you wouldn't care. That was the Sterling mantra, we thought you wouldn't care. They had mistaken my silence for absence, and now they were realizing that the quietest person in the room is often the one taking the most notes. The gallery show was set for a Thursday night in the city. I had moved the Sovereign chess set and the new piece, the Mirror Man, into the space under the cover of darkness. I had also invited a very specific list of guests. Not just the collectors and the influencers, but 3 of the city's top investigative journalists and the head of the Regional Building Safety Commission. I wasn't just showing art, I was hosting an unveiling. Harrison and Julian didn't know the full extent of what I had, but they knew I was a threat. On the afternoon of the show, Julian showed up at the gallery. He didn't come with a checkbook, he came with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. He walked into the space, his eyes skimming over my work with the same dismissive sneer he'd used since we were kids. Nice little setup, Mike, he said, tapping a finger against the glass of a display case. But you're playing in a league you don't understand. The developer has already signed the papers for the North Wood. By next week, that cabin is a pile of mulch. You can have your little night of fame, but on Monday, you're back to being the guy who whittles in the dark. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. Drop the legal challenge, or I'll make sure Sarah never works in a school in this state again. The mention of Sarah, the woman I loved, the teacher who had stood by me when I was a ghost, was the final spark. The Sterling's biggest mistake has always been assuming that everyone shares their fear of loss. But I had already lost everything they could take. I had no inheritance, no favor, and no fear. I looked at Julian. The man who was supposed to be my brother, but was really just a younger, cruder version of the Titan, and I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who knows the structural integrity of the bridge he's standing on, while the other person is walking into a chasm. "You're right about one thing, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the empty gallery. "I am playing in a different league. But it's not the one you think." I walked to the center of the room, to the draped figure of the Mirror Man, and I pulled the wooden key from my pocket. The big reveal for the end of this narrative arc isn't just the win in court, it's the realization that the Mirror Man isn't a statue. It's a vessel. I had spent the last 2 weeks hollow carving the base of the lightning-struck oak, and inside, I had placed the original ledger and the handwritten will. I had turned my art into a safe. The gallery show began, and the room was a sea of black ties and shimmering cocktail dresses. Harrison and Jolene arrived late, looking like the royalty they believed they were. They walked through the crowd, Harrison nodding to the journalists, entirely unaware that he was walking into his own deposition. He approached me, his eyes hard and cold. "Last chance, Michael," he whispered as the cameras began to flash. "Walk away, and we can still call this a family misunderstanding." I didn't answer. I stepped onto the small stage, the journalists leaning in, their recorders ready. I talked about the art, about the cedar and the maple, about the 500 hours of the Sovereign set. And then, I turned to the Mirror Man. "This piece is about reflection," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "It's about what we see when the masks are stripped away. It's about the things we bury in the foundation of our lives, thinking they'll never see the light." I reached for the base of the sculpture, my fingers finding the hidden catch that only the wooden key could release. The crowd went silent. Harrison's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine terror crossing his face as he saw the key. He started to move toward the stage, his hand reaching out to stop me, his mouth opening to shout. But it was too late. I turned the key, the oak groaning with the same sound as the workshop floorboard, and a hidden compartment slid open, revealing the yellowed pages of the ledger and the flannel-wrapped will. "My father says I build trinkets," I said, looking directly at the lead journalist from the Times. "But today, I'm building a case for the truth." Harrison reached the edge of the stage, his hand clutching the velvet rope, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. But as he opened his mouth to speak, a voice from the back of the room cut through the tension like a blade. It was the building safety commissioner, and he wasn't looking at the art. He was looking at the ledger in my hand. The commissioner's voice was the sound of a structural failure, low, gravelly, and final. Harrison froze on the edge of the stage, his hand still white-knuckled on the velvet rope, his face a grotesque mask of shock. The room, which had been buzzing with the polite chatter of the elite, went ice-cold. Every journalist in the front row pivoted toward the back, then back to the stage, their cameras clicking in a rhythmic, aggressive strobe. The ledger, the missing piece of the sterling legend, sat in my hands, a yellowed, fragile weight that felt heavier than the lightning-struck oak it had been hidden inside. I didn't wait for Harrison to recover. I handed the ledger directly to the commissioner, whose eyes were already scanning the margin notes about the foundation piles. Harrison lunged then, a desperate, animalistic movement to snatch the papers, but the journalists and the security I'd hired stepped in, creating a human wall. "It's over, Dad," I said, and the words felt like the final plane of a chisel, smoothing the grain of my life. The Sovereign set wasn't the gift. This is the truth about how you built your empire. Julian was white as a sheet, backing toward the exit, realizing that the resort project was now a toxic asset, and the disappointment of a brother had just deconstructed 30 years of sterling dominance in 30 seconds. The courtroom battle that followed wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was an autopsy. With the original ledger and the handwritten will entered into evidence, the sterling defense didn't just crumble, it disintegrated. The Building Safety Commission issued an immediate freeze on all sterling construction projects, and the Sterling Heights flagship was evacuated for emergency structural reinforcement. The scandal was the only thing on the news for months, the titan who built on sand, the mother who erased her son, and the artisan who found the truth in the wood. But the big reveal wasn't just the ledger. It was the moment in the deposition when my mother, Jolene, broke. Under oath, she admitted that she hadn't just simplified the will to help Julian. She had done it because Harrison had threatened to liquidate Grandpa Elias's entire estate into a blind trust if she didn't, effectively cutting her off from her own father's memory. Harrison hadn't just bullied me, he had held my mother's heritage hostage. The realization that my father was even smaller than I'd imagined was the final cut that let the light in. The judge's ruling was a masterclass in restorative justice. The simplified will was declared null and void, and the cabin, the North Woods, and a significant portion of the Sterling family's remaining assets were transferred to my name as restitution for the coordinated fraud. Harrison and Julian faced a litany of civil and criminal charges for the building violations, and by the time the dust settled, the Sterling name was no longer a symbol of power, it was a cautionary tale. I didn't stay for the final sentencing. I didn't need to see the Titan in a suit that wasn't tailored. I had the cabin. I had the tools. And most importantly, I had the sovereign set, sitting on Grandpa Elias's workbench, the king finally resting where he belonged. The healing didn't happen in the courtroom. It happened in the quiet hours at the cabin, when the only sound was the rhythm of my chisel and the rustle of the wind through the cedar trees. I spent the next year restoring the sanctuary Harrison had wanted to mulch. I fixed the roof, updated the plumbing, and turned the workshop into a world-renowned studio. People from across the globe began to make the pilgrimage to the woods, not to see the Sterling name, but to see the artisan son, who had built a life out of sawdust and courage. I held the solo exhibition I'd been promised, and the centerpiece wasn't the demure man, it was a new set I'd carved, titled The Foundation. It was made from the wood of the trees I'd saved, and it didn't represent tools or architects. It represented people, the quiet ones, the invisible ones, the ones who understand that the most beautiful shapes are often the ones you have to fight the hardest to find. Harrison tried to call me once, 6 months after the trial. I watched the phone vibrate on the workbench, his name flashing like a ghost from another life. I didn't pick up. I didn't need his apology, and I certainly didn't need his approval. I had spent 32 years looking for a reflection in a man who was hollow. Now, when I looked in the mirror, I saw Grandpa Elias's eyes, and I saw a man who knew his own worth. Julian moved to another state, trying to start over under a different name, still chasing the phantom of a power he never earned. My mother stays in touch, sending letters that I read but rarely answer. She's trying to find her own voice after decades of being Harrison's rug, and I hope she finds it. But my life is no longer a part of their architecture. As I stand on the porch tonight, looking out over the 5 acres of timberland that are legally and spiritually mine, the sovereign chess set sits in the window, catching the last orange glow of the sunset. It's no longer a Hail Mary or a prayer for a father's love. It's a trophy. It's a reminder that you can't earn love from someone who doesn't have the tools to give it, but you can build a life so sturdy and so beautiful that their absence doesn't even cause a draft. To anyone out there who is currently being told they are a disappointment or an afterthought, hear me, you are the architect of your own soul. The world might try to throw your masterpiece in the trash, but the trash doesn't define the art. You do. I reach out and touch the Cedar King, feeling the grain, the patience, and the history beneath my fingertips. The silence of the woods is no longer heavy, it's peaceful. I've stopped auditioning for a role I was never going to get, and I've started playing the game on my own board, by my own rules. The Sterling Empire might have been built on a lie, but this cabin, and the man inside it, is built on the truth. And the truth, much like a well-carved piece of cedar, only gets more beautiful with time. We are safe. We are seen. And finally, we are free. Stay quiet only if you want to, but never because you have to. I'll see you in the workshop.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.